Good morning.
Good morning, Grace. Are you ready to debate with me like in the old times?
Sure. Are we going to debate? Let's do it. I'm ready to go.
All right. From Columbia Journalism School in New York City, this is Juan Manuel Benítez Wants to Know. She was my colleague for years. For NY1, we covered City Hall and traveled together and launched the Off Topic on Politics podcast. Now, years later, I'm in academia and she is an advocate for civic reform. Grace Rauh is the executive director of Citizens Union and the Five Borough Institute. She's one of the sharpest minds in New York City, and I can't wait to talk to her about this competitive mayoral election, views on politics and the press, and why she thinks we should be voting for mayor and president at the same time. Grace, thank you for being on the podcast.
Juan, thank you for having me, and congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Before anything else, do you miss being in journalism?
Oh, my answer to that question has evolved. So I miss it less and less, which is good because it would be sad if I missed it more and more. Then I, might be questioning some of my choices. But I miss it less and less. I will always feel like reporters and journalists are my people, right? Like the way they see the world and interact with the world is very similar to the way I see it and think about it. But this role for me has been kind of the perfect fit because I'm still very much in the same universe that we occupied when we were full-time journalists. I just have a slightly different role and hat that I wear, but I still think of myself as a sort of advocate for New Yorkers, someone who is seeking information, calling out bad behavior in government or outside of government. I just have sort of a slightly different role to play.
Let's take you back to 2018, 2019. Imagine that we are back into the Off Topic on Politics studio, even though I'm sure you're not going to have the same freedom right now to talk or to speak your mind because of your role at those two organizations. But who do you think is going to win this election for mayor in New York?
Right now, I would say Zohran Mamdani is going to win the election for mayor. I think it is going to potentially be closer than the polls suggest right now. Some of that is just sort of reading the tea leaves of early voting. We had 5 times as many New Yorkers turn out to vote this weekend on the first 2 days of early voting. And unlike in the primary, it was not sort of a majority young voters that were turning out. It was a lot of older voters. And I really see this election in many ways as a generational divide in the city where Cuomo's base of support largely skews older, and Mamdani has tapped into all of this energy among young New Yorkers. So I voted early this weekend on Saturday, and I witnessed something that I really haven't seen before in a local race, where some people in my neighborhood were shouting at Cuomo supporters, "Get out of here." I live in Park Slope, full disclosure, but having a very combative a combative conversation with some Cuomo supporters who were out with signs, campaigning. That level of kind of headbutting and sort of on the street disagreement. We've seen it a bit in the presidential arena, but I just haven't seen it sort of play out in my neighborhood in quite the same way in a local race.
You talked about the first weekend of early voting. I also voted myself. 164,000 New Yorkers voted in the first weekend of early voting. I have to disagree with you. I don't think it's going to be a close election. I think it's going to be a landslide for Zohran Mamdani. And I'm surprised, actually, that so many people in the city feel that. Even I talk to a lot of people who tell me, I don't really agree with most of his policies, but I'm going to vote for him, which I don't quite understand. Or yes, I do, because sometimes voting is this emotional exercise more than rational in many ways. But are you surprised that Zohran Mamdani, his campaign, it seems to me, is really powerful right now, even though you and I covered the de Blasio administration. Many of the policies are similar to de Blasio's proposals. He thinks that de Blasio has been the best mayor New York City has had in the last 25 years. De Blasio is supporting his candidacy. De Blasio, it was extremely controversial back in the day because he would call himself a social democrat. And we covered that issue a lot together. So now we are going from the social democrat to the democratic socialist. I don't know what the differences are, but are you surprised that so quickly in New York City, New York voters are going back to progressive politics or politics that are more similar to de Blasio's when de Blasio has been so unpopular for so many years in the city?
So I think de Blasio's unpopularity had less to do with his policies and more to do with his personality and his way of being. Zohran Mamdani is a generational political talent, the likes of which I certainly haven't seen in my lifetime in New York. He is an incredibly effective communicator. I've heard from senior members of the de Blasio administration who are kind of pulling out their hair a little bit saying, freeze the rent. We did that. We froze the rent on rent stabilized apartments in New York. We got no credit for it. We never messaged it properly. And Mamdani has seized on a policy that has been done before. He's made it somehow seem new and revolutionary. And it has worked and it has resonated. So I think there's a lot of policy overlap. I agree. Certainly, universal childcare, which is an issue that Five Borough has done a lot of work on, and feels is hugely important that we make really meaningful progress on childcare because the costs have just gone so high, hugely unaffordable for so many families. But that, in many ways, feels like an expansion of what De Blasio did with universal pre-K. So on the policy front, I totally agree. A lot of overlap and similarities in terms of how they see the world. A key difference to me, though, is de Blasio, I felt was much more combative toward wealthy New Yorkers than Mamdani has been. So I watched the rally that he held last night with Bernie Sanders and AOC. And yes, Mamdani is talking about, fighting the oligarchy. But de Blasio, it often felt like was at war with the business community, and with wealthy New Yorkers, and sort of the philanthropic class of New York. And that always to me felt like just a huge miss because New York is thankfully home to a lot of wealthy people. And there is a culture in New York of wealthy people who give back to our cultural institutions, to the city. They serve on boards. So it just felt very short sighted, his approach. Whereas Mamdani has maintained his commitment to his policy priorities, but also has had a real open door when it comes to
Mhm.
wanting to dialogue and be in conversation with business leaders around the city with a big smile on his face, with a willingness to sit down to engage with just about anyone. De Blasio never seemed all that happy about the fight.
Now, as a reporter, you were educating voters with your reports and your analysis, and now you're doing almost the same thing. And I would like you to go through this exercise because many voters in New York City right now are going to the polls. They know about the mayoral campaign, but they don't know that much about the five ballot proposals and that they are going to encounter once they go vote. I don't know if we can go over them a little bit and you can
Yeah.
tell us the number one proposal, an amendment to allow Olympic sports complex in Essex County on state forest preserve land. This is a statewide proposal. And what is this about?
So I don't mean to correct you on your own podcast, Juan,
Mhm.
but
No,
there are six
please do
questions.
so.
There are six questions in total. So there's six
Six.
questions total, not five. But the first is that statewide question about the Adirondacks. This really, at a high level, is about giving some flexibility for the Adirondack region to update its facilities so that it can hold large scale events. With Citizens Union, has endorsed all six. Just at the outset, I should say, we are recommending in our voter guide that New York City voters vote yes on all six of these ballot questions, which makes it very easy when you go into the polls, vote yes on all six of these questions. But it would give the Adirondack region the ability to update its Olympic facilities, which we think is important just for the economic vitality of the region. And then it also calls for growing the amount of protected land. So adding additional, I believe it's something like 2,500 additional acres of protected land, which we think strikes the right balance and allows for kind of the modernization that's needed.
Now, 2, 3, and 4 have to do with housing and housing construction in the city and zoning. Can you tell us a little bit about these three that knowing that the housing crisis is one of the top issues right now, I guess these are extremely important and New Yorkers should weigh in these questions.
Yes. So these questions you can think of really as a package of proposals that at a high level are designed to make it easier and speed up the creation of affordable housing in the city. These have also been the questions that have triggered the biggest political fight. Folks listening to this podcast may have received mailers or seen advocacy on one side or the other around these questions. Again, Citizens Union is recommending New Yorkers vote yes on all of these. We think these are very measured, common sense reforms designed to fast track affordable housing in New York City and designed to clear what has become a real barrier to progress. And that is a longstanding now practice in the city council that is known as member deference. So this is where a single member of the city council, if there is a project in their district that requires some kind of special approval, it can't just be embarked on as of right, comes before the council and that council member says, nope, I don't want this in my district. They effectively have veto power. Their colleagues on the city council say, we will back you up. We will block this project. And while on its face that may seem reasonable to some New Yorkers who say, well, yeah, that's my local representative, they should have an outsized say in what comes into our district. What has ended up happening is that there are all sorts of projects that on a hyper local level face opposition. Many New Yorkers, the phrase not in my backyard, they may say we need more housing in the city, but when there's a project that's, within a block or two of where they live, they'll say, well, that's the wrong spot for it. It needs to go somewhere else. So there is this kind of human reaction to new development that is often very resistant to new projects like this. And so what has happened is all sorts of new housing that is very much needed. We have a vacancy rate in apartments in New York City that is a record low of about like 1.5%. It is impossible. That includes market rate apartments. We're not just talking about affordable. It is so difficult to find an apartment right now, let alone be able to actually afford the rent. We have very vast needs when it comes to creating more housing.
But don't you think that this is giving too much power to developers and to the mayor and
No,
taking it
they
away from
still,
the city council?
because they still have to go through an approval process. So what it means, what's on the table essentially is there is the idea of an appeals board, so that if a project is blocked at the council level by an individual member, a developer can appeal to a board that would be comprised of the mayor, the city council speaker, and the borough president of the borough that project is slated to go in. And so it's not sort of a given that it bypasses the council member and gets, sort of the stamp of approval, but it does mean that the people who are assessing that project have the city's broader interests in mind. That would certainly be the case of the mayor. It should be the case of the city council speaker. And then for the borough president, they're not just thinking about what an individual neighborhood or council district may want. They're thinking about the need of their borough because they know they are going to be held accountable for how much housing is available in their borough. And so we think this is a very reasonable reform. It doesn't mean that everything just gets some kind of stamp of approval, but this creates another pathway for projects that hit roadblocks in the city council to be assessed by a group of elected officials who are accountable to the voters, but who may have and should have, frankly, the interests of the city and of their borough in mind, not just their district.
Now, number 5, create a digital city map to modernize city operations. What does that mean?
So, right now, I mean, this will probably not surprise you. The city planning department is working off of all sorts of different paper maps, as I understand it. So,
No way.
this is a very, I would say, non-controversial proposal. So we have not heard pushback really from anybody about this idea. But this is to create sort of a single source of information that is digital, that developers, that residents, that elected officials, government officials can all use when they're making zoning decisions or planning for projects. So this feels like a very obvious basic step forward in terms of the much needed digital transformation of New York City government.
Now let's debate. Number 6, you want to move the local elections to presidential election years to increase voter participation. Okay, we agree. New Yorkers don't like to vote that much. We have extremely low turnout rates in the city every 4 years for the local elections. But why should we put all the elections at the same time, like the federal and the local elections?
Okay, so you are correct. We have very low voter turnout. But the other thing to state, just to sort of set the stage for this conversation, is not just that we have low voter turnout, but that turnout has been declining pretty steadily since 1989. So we had 60% voter turnout in the 1989 general election. It has been going downhill since. And in 2021, we hit a new record low of just 23% of voters in New York City who came out in the general election. So to us, it is a sign that the status quo is not working, right? We should be looking at these numbers, and when you see them on a chart, your jaw literally will drop. I this is like an alarm going off. The health and strength of our democracy depends on participation from voters and from residents. And they are, for a whole host of different reasons, choosing to stay home and not participate in these hugely consequential local elections. So I just want to say that at the outset. Now, we do know when we look at the data that it's not that they're staying home for all elections. They do go out to vote in vastly higher numbers in presidential election years and gubernatorial years. But the highest turnout rates are in presidential years, where we often see 2-3 times as many voters go to the polls.
And here's the problem as I see it, Grace, because
Yes.
presidential politics, they take everything. They take over our TV screens and newspapers. We're always talking about Trump. Don't you fear that by putting those elections, setting them at the same time, people are not going to be paying enough attention to the race for mayor, the race for city council, knowing, for instance, that even people who I thought I was a well-informed voter, I went to the polls yesterday and I didn't even know that some of these candidates were on the ballot. I don't know how much bandwidth as a voter we all have. Don't you think that New York voters are not going to be well informed when it comes to electing their local officials if they are just paying attention to the presidential race?
Okay, so a couple things in response to that. So to be clear, right, I'm a former political reporter. Mayoral election year is like my Super Bowl, right? I am following every up and down in this race, reading about the ballot measures. You and I are deep on all of this stuff. But one, we are total outliers in the city. And I do think we will see higher turnout this year because it's such a tight race. But historically, we can look back at mayoral elections of years past. Turnout is incredibly low, and that is when the entire conversation in the city is theoretically about these local issues. People may be hearing it. If they are hearing it, the vast majority of them are still staying home and are not participating in these elections. So something is fundamentally broken with this system. I do think that most voters, you probably have this experience like I do. Now with early voting, it's not just on election day. I start getting text messages from friends who are saying, how should I vote? Tell me how to vote. People are asking me, how do I vote for mayor? Who should I vote for city council? How should I vote on these ballot measures? And these are the people who actually are the engaged voters who are turning out in these local elections already. These aren't the
Mhm.
people who are staying home. And they are doing their homework as they go to the polls. That is what most people do. They get up to speed sort of as quickly as possible before they have to go to the polls and make a decision. And those are the people who are actually turning out to vote.
At
Do
some
think
point, we're just going
I
to have to take their ballots and fill them out ourselves, I
They
think.
I mean, we do the Board of Elections. I mean, you can get a sample ballot. You could do that, and maybe that would be something that we do to make it easier for New Yorkers when they go to the polls to kind of have like a cheat sheet, so they're ready to go and they fill it out in advance and can just sort of, copy their sample ballot when they get there. But look, the other thing to keep in mind is that low turnout elections are decided by an electorate that is not representative of the city as a whole. So not only do we have low voter turnout in our existing off cycle elections, but the voters that do turn out are predominantly older, wealthier, and whiter than than the voting population of New York City as a whole. When we have higher turnout in presidential years, it is much more representative of the city, which we think is good for democracy. We want to have a broader cross section of New Yorkers choosing their leaders. And we are certainly not first city to consider making a move like this. We are sort of following in the footsteps of other major cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Austin, Texas, Baltimore, Maryland, that have made this shift. They have benefited from the significant boost in voter turnout. We're having a local race against the backdrop of just unrelenting news coming out of Washington every single day related to President Trump and his administration. And yes, I agree. A presidential election is sort of that on a different scale, but we are still having these important conversations about local issues in New York. We thankfully have a robust press corps in New York and a
But that's
lot of
you
local.
see, but wait, that's my next point, right?
Yes.
Because in my current role, I advocate for local journalism. In your current role, you advocate for civic reform. Don't you fear that given the crisis that we see in local journalism, don't you think that by merging those two huge things together, a presidential race and a mayoral race, that local journalism is going to lose? Local stations and local newspapers, they get a lot of funding thanks to those elections because you have all the ads for candidates out there. But if people are like just interested in presidential politics and the resources, local journalism, local news outlets, and the resources are limited for them, don't you fear that we're going to stop covering city issues, local issues the way we should, and that we're going to lose quality of the elected officials that we are electing? Remember how we missed so many signs with, for instance, George Santos in that race because nobody was paying attention to that race. We were in the middle of the pandemic, basically. So don't you fear that that could happen and this could hurt local journalism?
So the example you just gave is already happening, with
Right. It could
George
be, but it could
Santos.
be
It
worse.
already happened. So it's not like when we are only focused on local races, then we don't miss anything. Right. So that's already happening. I think that I care deeply about having a robust and healthy local press corps. I think it's been really exciting that we have more and more, especially nonprofit, sort of smaller outlets that have sprung up in recent years. We also have people like you who maybe are not a full-time journalist, but sort of function in many ways like a journalist in New York with your podcast, you're writing a Substack. So we have the ability to hear from and learn from so many New Yorkers who so deeply understand local politics and the issues. I think that's incredibly important. I'm confident that will continue. But I really think this is about the health of our democracy, right? When fewer than 1 in 4 New Yorkers are voting in these races and cycle after cycle, we're seeing those numbers decline. Like we can't just say, there's nothing we can do. We need to just sort of let it play out and hope that if we sort of do 10 more stories on the mayor's race, then we'll, boost voter turnout by 10%. it's sadly not happening. I wish that wasn't the case. Trust me. I I think in my ideal world, everybody would be tuned in New York talking about these races and turning out to vote, but that is just not what is happening. So there is some level of voter fatigue. We know from nonprofits that do grassroots get out the vote efforts, they tell us that their budgets are the biggest to do this work in a presidential year. That's when they get federal funding. That's when they are able to go knock on doors, make sure voters are going to the polls. And so to us, this feels like a really common sense way to ensure, with a shift in the calendar, that many more New Yorkers are having a direct say in choosing their leaders, that we have a much more representative democracy. And that means that the leaders that get into office are not just accountable to this smaller subset of the electorate, but they are accountable to a much bigger group of New Yorkers. We think that's good for having responsive government because we need government leaders who are responding to the needs of New Yorkers. When they are not doing that, it just breeds greater distrust and greater disengagement from government, from our democratic processes. And at a moment like the one we're in right now, we should be thinking of ways and focusing on ways to strengthen that democracy. And we think a very obvious way to do that is by boosting voter turnout.
You spoke about how now we consume information in different ways, like with podcasts, for instance, right? And we launched Off Topic on Politics, you and I with Zach Fink back in 2018. That was when all these podcasts were coming out, and people were getting used to consuming news and information in a different way. I'm sure you're still a fan of some podcasts. What are the top three, your go-to podcasts every week or almost every week that you listen to?
Ooh, good question. So I love FAQ NYC, which is on the city. Christina Greer, Katie Honan, Harry Siegel. I think that is a fantastic conversation that they are having about New York. And they, much like the three of us did on our podcast, I think, but they mix it up, right? They are not sort of in lockstep with each other necessarily and bring a lot of great viewpoints into the conversation. I have to say, obviously, this is a well listened to podcast, but the daily I find on the New York Times is still just incredibly helpful for going deep on individual stories, which I love. I don't listen to it every single day, but I find that, I will go back through and say, oh, I really want to understand this better. And I find that I'll tune in for things, sort of certain stories out of Washington or international news. It's a great guide through all of that. Well, I love your podcast, which
Thank
is a
you.
new addition to the space. And I think you've also, in a very early time, distinguished yourself with some stellar guests. I'm not just saying that because I'm now one of them.
You are one of them.
You've had
Yes.
you've had some great guests on the podcast, and you also, I know we're going to get into it, but like, you're not just keeping it on the news, but also sort of a deeper dive into who people are, what motivates them, makes them tick. And I think that's so interesting and like a great differentiator because people are listening to these conversations, to get sort of up to speed on different issues, but they also kind of want to get to know the people who are at the table having the conversation. So I think you're doing a fantastic job, Juan. So you are now one of the must listen to podcasts in New York.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you. And listen, one of my best friends had a birthday last week and I wanted to buy a book. And now that I have the podcast and I'm asking these questions, it's so easy to pick one. So I knew what to pick because Brian Lair, who was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, he recommended a book. But what's a book that you recommend right now that you just read, or the last book that you read that you think people should be getting and reading?
So I just read The Gods of New York.
Oh my God, everybody's talking about the same book. I just started this morning, but
It's
go ahead.
so good, by Jonathan Mahler. It is, so he's a New York Times Magazine reporter. The book focuses on 4 years in New York City history, modern New York history, 1886 through 1990, and really sort of tells the history of New York during that era by focusing on some larger than life figures who, many of whom are still on the stage and dominating the conversation. Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, Al Sharpton, Larry Kramer, the AIDS activist, Spike Lee, oh, and Ed Koch, of course, who was mayor during that time on his third term. What was incredible to me about that was it was a period of history that I did know a lot about. You know, one of the great things about NY1, where both of us worked for so many years, is I I think there's a real effort to sort of contextualize what is happening in the city at a given time with sort of historical precedent. And also, we did a whole bunch of different look backs on sort of pivotal moments in New York history with the political team there. So the history was one that I was deeply familiar with, just hadn't, I think, in my own mind, had it all knit together in the same way. So it was, I had done a deep dive on kind of the ACT UP AIDS activist movement in the late 1980s. But I don't know that I had fully sort of layered that on top of the corruption investigations into Mayor Koch's administration. And I don't think that was layered on top of sort of the rise and prominence of Donald Trump as this hotshot real estate developer, Rudy Giuliani as the U.S. attorney in the Southern District pursuing all these corruption cases against Koch's administration and then against sort of like Wall Street titans to take them down. So it was, and then Spike Lee and Al Sharpton, there was something about sort of everything got knitted together in a way that just was sort of breathtaking. So it's a great read for anyone who cares about New York, but also in this strange way. And I said this to Jonathan, who was incredibly gracious and came and spoke at our annual members meeting at Citizens Union a few weeks ago. I said, I actually found it to be incredibly comforting in this messed up way to read about this highly toxic and divided and really, painful period of time in New York's history, because I have found this year to be incredibly destabilizing and in many ways sad. Just the divisions within the city that have been sort of laid bare in the context of this mayoral race. The scene that I witnessed in my neighborhood on the first day of early voting with people sort of shouting at each other over candidates in the race. I've lived in New York sort of just shy of 20 years, had not seen that level of kind of pain and clashing. And so there was some comfort that I got from reading about this period in New York where there was so much pain and division and really like racial strife and tension in the city. And so I don't think it's meant to be kind of like a feel good read, so to speak, but it made me feel like, okay, New York has always gone through difficult periods where the city does feel and can feel like it's getting ripped apart, but we have also throughout history kind of like come back together and healed. And I think of myself as a New York patriot where like, there is much more that unites us than divides us in New York. And so I would highly recommend that book.
Is there a building or a place in the city that you would like to see as a new landmark?
So I had a great time. I was prepping for your podcast last night, Juan, with my 11-year-old daughter. The first thing that came to mind was Katz's Deli on the Lower East Side. But it's not just Katz's. I would put like a Barney Greengrass in there or Russ and Daughters on the Lower East Side. I think there are these amazing either restaurants and food establishments or sort of grocers that truly feel like an incredible piece of New York City history. I continue to frequent them because the food is fabulous, but also because it's a little bit like a, kind of time travel portal where I can bring my kids to places that in some cases I went to as a child, but in others have been around just for generations and are kind of a throwback to the old New York. I do think we should have some kind of like landmark process. Obviously, you don't want to put restrictions on businesses so they can't function in the modern era, but just a nod to these places, which are so incredible and such an important part of our history. I love to eat, as you know, I'm very food focused. I think places like that are such a treasure in the city.
And Grace, think that we are not recording anymore. We are, though. Whoever wins the election for mayor is going to put together a transition team to help him, either Mamdani or Cuomo, we believe, put together an administration. So are you expecting Mayor-elect Mamdani or Mayor-elect Cuomo to give you a call to have you in their transition team?
They should. They should give me a call. I would be happy and honored to help advise the next mayor, whoever it is, in terms of what is needed and just in choosing key leaders in their administration. And I should note, Juan, we at Citizens Union put out last week our ethics and accountability agenda for the next mayor. It has largely been kind of a little bit receded into the background, but let's not forget the next mayor is coming in on the heels of a mayor who was indicted on corruption charges. Those charges were later dropped by the Trump Justice Department. Had many senior leaders in his administration who were either indicted or accused of misconduct, corruption. There's been multiple lawsuits about alleged misconduct focused on the NYPD and the former leadership there. So the next mayor of New York really has a lot of work to do to rebuild trust in government and raise the bar and establish, once again, a culture of ethics and accountability in City Hall. And so that is a core area that we at Citizens Union have said we pledge and are eager to work with the new administration to advance key reforms to ensure that we never again have a situation like the one that we have had under Mayor Adams, where really an unprecedented amount of senior leaders who many of whom remained in power for a long time had been credibly accused of misconduct.
And I know that you don't want to run for office, but imagine I'm Zohran Mamdani, mayor-elect, or Andrew Cuomo, mayor-elect. Grace, I want you on my administration. What job do you want?
Oh, what job do I want? I mean, I have a great job. So I have a great job. I think
Think that we are not recording. Nobody at Citizens Union is listening to this conversation. Nobody at the Institute.
Juan, everyone is listening to this podcast.
Deputy mayor of what?
So I do think I've never served in government. It's interesting for someone like me, and you're, in a similar boat. We have spent our careers around government, but we have not served in government unless you have some secret government stint that you did early in your career that I don't know about. So we haven't served in government. I do have tremendous respect and admiration for the leaders who take on these big jobs. No one is paid enough. They work so much. These roles are so incredibly demanding. And in part because we have a robust press corps, you are constantly under a microscope in terms of what you say and do, all of which is fair given kind of the stakes of these jobs and the responsibility that you hold in terms of the tax dollars that are at your disposal and the responsibility you have to improve the city and make it work better for New Yorkers. I think I can be a partner to folks in government from my perch at Citizens Union, which I think is great. And I would be honored to be part of any kind of transition committee to help sort of think strategically about who are the right people that we need in government. How do you set it up so that it best serves New York and that we can raise the bar when it comes to ethics and accountability in particular?
If you end up serving in government, I hope you already had that conversation with your husband. Grace Rauh, thank you so much. And thank you so much for your service to the city and to journalism. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations again. I think it's fantastic. I'm really excited for you.
Thank you so much. And that's it for Juan Manuel Benítez Wants to Know. Follow us on YouTube, on Substack, and also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you have any comments, let us know. That's it for this episode. See you next time.